Hi everyone, I'm Professor Casey, and this is quick review number 7 for EGR 112, where we'll be talking about arrays. We're going to be talking about both arrays used in the regular main function of C, as well as using arrays with functions and passing them down. So this example will be two things where the program does the exact same thing, one without using functions and one with using functions, so you can see how that works. Let's jump in. Okay, so let's take a look at this example. This is a super simple program just to calculate the average of an array with multiple inputs. So because I don't want to waste a bunch of time entering data, I've made the max size 10, just so I won't be able to enter more than 10 numbers. But when you're actually doing this in real life, if you don't know how many data points you're gonna have, you probably wanna make that number a little bit bigger. I've just declared some regular variables, average and sum, and I have made an array called age. This is 10 units big, right? Because I've made it this max size with the macros that we saw. But you could declare this as 10, you could declare it as 100, whatever you need. I just want to make sure I don't waste a ton of time entering data, so I've made it pretty small. All we're going to do here is we're going to enter the ages for this array. They're going to get stored in one at a time, and then we're going to sum them and print out the average. So this is a super simple program. Let's look up here at how we declare the array first. So we always declare an array with the data type. And remember that the data type of the array is going to be the data type of every single element in the array. So in this case, I have 10 things in my array. Every single one of those is going to be a float type. And they're going to be back to back to back in memory, so I can access them one after another after another. Now, you could make this an integer array, you can make it a char array, you can make it whatever you want, but I want this to be able to accommodate decimals, so I've made it a float array. Remember that every single element of the array will be the same data type. You can't mix and match. So I couldn't have an integer and a float in the same array. It doesn't work that way. The second thing I want to make sure we hit on here is how to store data in the array. Because as soon as you declare it, right, all we've done is say all these places in memory are together, but we haven't actually stored anything in there. So one of the ways you can do that is by declaring it like this inside curly brackets. You can only do this when you first declare the array. You can't just choose to do this later on. This is the only time you can actually do this. I can set each of the elements in this array equal to a specific number. Now, if you remember, up here, I made my array max size, which is just 10. But if you look at the total number I have in here, I only have 6. Well, my array still has 10 things in it, but the other ones are 0. They're just not in here. So when I loop, if I know how many elements I have in my array, when I use my for loop, I would use 6 here instead of max size, if I know exactly how many are in there. Assuming I don't do that, right? Because a lot of the time you won't know what's going to be in your array. We can have the user enter the data, like I'm showing you here, just using regular scanf, or you can read it in from a file, which we talked about how to do in the file IO lecture. Let's say I'm entering it in. So I'm getting input from the user and I'm storing it into an array. I have to give them a prompt, so tell them, please enter the ages. It's also nice to tell them how many they're going to have to enter, so I'll say 10 here. Here, I've made my counter variable I, and I've looped as long as I is less than max size because that's the size of my array. Now, if I wanted to have less, right, I could loop until 5 or something else. But here, I'm going to enter all 10 ages, and then I'm going to scan each one. So when I scan, right, I can't just say age. That would be the address of the first element of the array. But what I can do is store at the address of the ith element. Now remember, I is my counter, so the first time this will be 0. So I'll be storing it in the element 0 of the array, and then the second time will be 1 and 2. And this is a really nice way to be able to store everything right in a row in the array. And we're only storing 10 because that's the maximum size. Whenever you're working with arrays, you're almost always going to be using for loops. And we do that because you usually know how big the array is going to be. Even when we don't know how big the array is going to be, like with a file, you're still going to use a for loop to scan it in, and all you have to do is check until that element is not equal to the end of file. And if you need a refresher on how to do that, you can see the file IO quick review. Okay, so now I've scanned all my data in. What I'm going to do is sum it. So I could have done this in the same for loop, but I wanted to make sure I hit on exactly how these for loops work and what you need. Remember, if you're doing 2 different for loops, you need 2 separate counters. That's best practice. I'm gonna loop for the same number of times as I entered because I don't wanna forget any numbers. And I'm going to sum them. So how I do that is I take my sum, I set it equal to the previous sum plus age j. And this is just the elements in the array that are going to keep cycling through. So this will be age 0, age 1, age 2, etc. until I get to age of max size, which is 10. The last thing I have to do is actually take the average. So this is just adding up all the numbers together. What I then have to do is divide them by the total amount of numbers to get the average. And what I should definitely do before I start this is set both the sum and the average equal to 0. So that I know there's nothing actually starting in here. The last thing I do is I print out the average age. And remember, something else I can do here, just to refresh, I don't actually have to type all that out. I could use the shorthand, sum equals sum plus age j. This is just a shorthand for doing that, and you'll see that frequently. Okay, so let's go ahead and build this. I'll run it. So the first thing I have to do is enter 10 ages. These are floats, so they can be different decimals on the ends. It doesn't matter. Maybe I'm entering ages of kids at a daycare or something like that. All right, so it takes in those 10 inputs, right? It's going to sum them all in this separate for loop, which again, I could have done in the same loop up here. I just want to get you some practice. And then take the average by dividing by max size. Okay, so that's fairly simple. We can use arrays to take in data scanned from a user, and we know how to do that. The other thing I want to show you is how to use arrays with functions. Now, this is the exact same program. So all that's happening here is we're going to sum things. However, this time I've done it inside of a function because I want to show you and tell you to remember how to pass arrays to functions. That's going to be really important. So you'll see main looks exactly the same up to about this point. Right? We've declared our variables. I haven't declared sum because I actually do the sum inside my function down there, my average function, but everything else looks pretty much the same. Remember, when you use functions, you have to use a function prototype. That's one of the key things with functions. You have to use a function prototype. The function prototype tells the return value, it has a name, and it has the data types and hopefully the names of the inputs. You don't technically have to put the names of the inputs, but you should. It's a good habit to get into. And if I had more inputs, I would just separate them by a comma all through here. Okay, so same thing. I have to enter all 10 of the ages that I want to average. But once I do that, you'll see I don't have a sum or any other calculations in main. All I have is this function call. Okay, so all I'm calling is average, and then I'm sending down age. Well, remember, age is the name of my array. And by definition, arrays are pointers. So this actually is just the address of where the array starts. And because of that, this function can access that array wherever it is because it knows where it is. It has an address. So once it gets to this line, remember we do everything on this side of the equal sign first. It jumps down to the function and passes age down as A. So once we get to line 19, we actually jump down. Anytime I see A, that's actually referring to the age array I have declared up in main. So this is call by reference, an example of call by reference. Once I'm in here, I have a counter variable, I have my average and sum, gotta set those equal to 0. I have my for loop, right? This looks exactly the same as inside my other array function, or my other array program that wasn't using functions. And I go through and I just sum all the elements of A. And remember, every time you see A, that's referring back to age, this array up here. So I sum all of those elements. I take the average of them, and then what I'm doing here is I'm returning average. So I take that number, I return it back. If you remember how functions work, this is call by value part. It returns up here and it replaces the function call with the number it returns. So what's actually happening is I'm setting a number equal to average. And then back in main, I'm printing out the average. Okay, so fairly simple so far. Let's go ahead and run this. I don't remember exactly what ages I entered, but I'll try and keep them similar. Okay, so the average age is 4.35. And how that got to us, remember, is that it was passed down. Those array elements, all those ages I entered were passed down from age to A. It summed them all up, stored it in average, and then sent that value back to be printed out in main. So that's how this value actually came about. Now, just a quick review of functions, right? I did this with call by value, but I could also include call by reference so I didn't have to return anything. Now, this is a really simple way to do this, but what I could also do is just send down another input into my function and then use pointers and say, I don't actually have to return anything. I'm just going to store it in this value up in main. So let me make some changes real quick and I'll show you how that works. Okay, so I'm almost done changing up things inside of my function to make it call by reference. The last thing I have to do, remember, because I'm actually not returning anything anymore, is make this a void function. I'll be returning that value through my call by reference variable. So I've changed my function type up here to void, so I have to change this one to void. And the other thing I did was make sure that I didn't set this equal to anything anymore. We'll be changing AVGE average directly through my function, so I don't even have to return anything anymore. So once I build this, I should get my warning to go away. Okay, so now that I've done that, just adding one thing makes me not have to return this. Now, returning is probably the easier way, but I just want to make sure you understand how to use call by reference functions. Okay, so let's build one more time and we'll run it. And let's make sure this looks right. So I don't remember exactly what I entered, but I'll try and keep it in the same range. Okay, so I've entered all of those numbers, and now what happened, if we look back at our program here, is we've taken all the numbers we entered, sent them down in this array called age, and we've also sent the address of our average variable down so that it can get stored, it can have stuff stored in it from this function. So I send that down, sum up all my parts, right? Do some calculations and then save it in the pointer AVG, which just points back to AVGE up here, my average variable in main. So whenever I change this, it automatically changes this variable. And when I print that out, that value is already stored in there. All right, so a few things to remember with arrays. Make sure when you declare them that everything you store inside that array will be the same data type. Make sure you set up the array so that when you're going to store stuff in it, it's a little bit bigger than what you probably need. You always want that extra space. If you're scanning things into an array through user entry, you're going to need a for loop. You could also use a for loop by taking in data from a file, using that fscanf that we talked about in the file IO review. You can also, though it's rare, set the array equal to the exact numbers that you need, which we talked about at the beginning of the video. Remember, with arrays, you're going to be using a lot of for loops, so make sure you keep track of those and have individual counters for each one. If you're sending arrays down to functions, all you have to do is send the name and then the brackets. You should try and include the number inside the brackets, but technically you don't have to. All right, thank you for joining me for quick review 7 for EGR 112, which is focused on arrays. We talked about arrays, using arrays with functions, and even a quick review on how to do call by reference with arrays and functions. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email or leave a comment below. Again, I'm Professor Casey. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you have a great one.